Remember when you were a kid and somebody would give you something and then immediately they'd take it away? Hey, no takebacks! No takebacks. That phrase exists because we all know how awful it feels for someone to give you something and they let you believe that it's yours only to then take it back. And that's one of the most unsettling things about the parable that Jesus tells in Matthew 18. And I think that we as Christians have largely overlooked its pretty haunting implications. He tells the story of a man who's been forgiven an impossible debt, and just a few verses later, before the story's over, that forgiveness is taken away. Why? Why would Jesus tell a story like this? Let's take a look at it real quick. Here's the quick version of the story. A servant owes a king a really large debt, and the king, out of his kindness, forgives that servant his debt. And then immediately after, the servant refuses to forgive the debt of a fellow servant who owes him way less. The king hears about this and naturally is pretty upset, and so he goes and he takes back the canceling of that debt and hands that first servant into the hands of a group of people called basanistes in the Greek, which means tormenting jailers. And then Jesus says this: "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from the heart." Wait, what? So God's just going to take back our forgiveness? Before we answer that, we have to understand something about these two debts. The first servant owes the king a debt of 10,000 talents. We'll talk about how much that is in just a second, but for now, just know that it's in the billions with a B. So the fact that the man begs for more time and then promises to pay back this debt shows that he's completely unhinged. There's no way he's going to do this. But the king has compassion on him, even though his claim is absurd, and he forgives him. But then that second debt is 100 denarii. A denarius is a day's wage, so 100 days' wages. Let's think, like, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars that the second servant owes the first servant. The fact that he's upset at being owed tens of thousands of dollars and not getting paid back is not strange, but it's in the comparison between the two debts that we see what Jesus is trying to do here. Now, billions is like a word that is really hard to conceive of. Our brains can't necessarily hold what that idea looks like, and so I think showing you something visual is going to be a lot more helpful. Now, because the modern economy is so much different, it's really hard to have an exact match for what the spending power of these ancient denominations that Jesus used were. But what's cool is we have an exact ratio of what the first debt was to the second debt. We know what a talent was, and we know what a denarius was. Jesus wants you to hear the absurdity of the comparison. This is a little more than 2.5 gallons of sand, and this represents the first servant's debt, in a way. If we wanted to represent the second servant's debt, we'd have to do that with this. This is a quarter of a teaspoon, and it would be... Why is it so hard to get? This would be the second servant's debt. It's a little bit more because it's closer to a fifth of a teaspoon. You see the gravity of that comparison? No, you don't, because it's still not accurate. This compared to this is still 100 times less than the actual debts being represented in Jesus's parables. I would need to do this 100 more times, and then that would be 10,000 talents compared to 100 denarii. So you could see why the king would be pretty flabbergasted that the servant wasn't willing to forgive that. So that's where we get this taking back of forgiveness component of this parable. And even if it's not our favorite thing to think about, once you understand the proportions, it makes a little more sense why the king would react so strongly. And even though I think the message is already a little bit on the nose, just in case you missed it, Jesus tags on, "And this is how the Father is going to treat you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart." There's a clear big takeaway point, but make sure you stick around to the end because I'm going to give you 3 things that we can actually do with this in our lives that should change our day-to-day. So that's the big takeaway for us as Jesus followers when we consider what the Father was willing to forgive for us, when we consider the price. Jesus hadn't even done it yet, but he knows the price he's going to pay. He had already predicted his execution, the cost of his own life. When we consider the billions that the Father forgave by sending his Son to die for us on the cross, it puts into perspective the tens of thousands that we might need to forgive when forgiving our brothers and sisters. You see, I don't think Jesus is just issuing a threat so that we can be scared into forgiving other people, but rather what I think Jesus is doing is he's inviting us into a new perception of reality, a new perspective, a new way of thinking about things. And we see this in the response of the servant. There are three things in the story that I think show that this servant absolutely lacked perspective. First is the fact that he says, hey, I'll pay you back. Yeah, right. Where are you going to find billions of dollars to pay back? The second thing is that he chokes his fellow servant and sends him to debtor's prison. And the last one, I realized, he never celebrates. There's no scene where he runs home to his family to say, honey, I've been forgiven of that huge debt. We don't even hear him say thank you in the parable. And there's a metaphor for me that I think is really helpful. And it's because I'm kind of a nerd. I love a good Excel spreadsheet. There's a flock of parrots in our neighborhood. I don't know if you can hear that. When my wife and I first got married, we tracked every expense. We saved every receipt, and I put it into an Excel spreadsheet to see how much money was coming in and how much money was going out. We had very low-paying jobs, and so this was mostly out of necessity, and I liked Excel. Trying to budget this way, you have to live according to the spreadsheet. You have to track everything. Otherwise, it's just busy work, putting some numbers in and not others. This first servant was living according to the spreadsheet. He had his record there of how much he owed and how much he was owed. And the thing that the king did is the king threw out the spreadsheet. He went into the servant's app folder and dragged Excel into the trash can, which because of his liabilities and his assets was a really good thing for him. But this fool, he decides, no, I want my spreadsheet back. He reinstalls Excel and starts choking out a person who's on his they better pay me back list, which is why I think the king is not being cruel here. Here's what he's doing. Essentially, he's telling this servant, hey, it seems like you really want to live by the spreadsheet. If you want to live by the spreadsheet, we can, but I don't think you're going to like it. Hence Jesus' closing line, if you do not forgive your brother from the heart, then neither will your heavenly Father forgive you. And it's not because he's cruel, but he's giving you a choice. Do you want to play by the spreadsheet or not? But that's not all. There are three practical observations that I want to share with you that I think could transform our day-to-day life and also help us to process through what Jesus is offering here in this parable. The first thing I want to point out is that the small debt does actually hurt. Jesus isn't saying, well, your father forgave you so much, and so forgiving other people should be nothing to you. We see this in the unit of measurement that Jesus uses. He says the man is owed 100 denarii. 10 to 20 grand hurts. No one who's owed $15,000 says, whatever, it's just chump change, unless you're a billionaire, if you're the king in the parable maybe. What Jesus is showing us here is that the forgiveness does still hurt. That wound did hurt. That thing that was done to you is painful. But he's inviting us to have perspective so that we can forgive, even though it was painful. So Jesus isn't saying, stuff your feelings down and pretend like the thing didn't happen, but rather he's saying, yeah, that hurts. That's really difficult. But remember the cross. Grieve the pain. Don't just sweep it under the rug. You can name it and say, that hurt. But because of what God did for me, I will forgive you from the heart. And that's the second thing, is that Jesus says you are to forgive them from the heart. And we forgive from the heart because forgiveness is something that happens in the heart. And this is an important distinction that I think people who have suffered through difficult situations need to know, is that forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. Forgiveness is something that happens in here, where you release the burden, you release holding it against that other person. But it doesn't mean you automatically become best friends again. That's reconciliation. You see, even if the foolish servant forgave the second servant, it doesn't mean that that servant needs to continue lending 10 to 20 grand to that other guy over and over again. It's more about remember what you were forgiven and do something about that in here. Jesus says, forgive them from your heart. And even though forgiveness and reconciliation are two distinct phenomena, I think we could still learn something about reconciliation from this line, that it's in the heart. And if we borrow the language from the image before, If we're living by the spreadsheet, I've found that that never bodes well for a relationship. If you're keeping score on how many times you've paid for dinner with a friend, that's probably not the most functional friendship. If you are keeping records of wrongs with your spouse and records of rights that you have done with your spouse, you're living according to the spreadsheet, and that's not going to do good things in here. Forgiveness happens in the heart, and functional relationships also have some hard stuff involved. And speaking of functional relationships, that's the last point, is that we should start with the people closest to us. Usually we start these videos with context, but I think that in this video I wanted to end with it, because if you look at the context, it teaches you something about the situation that Jesus is speaking into. If you look at Matthew chapter 18, Jesus is addressing when there are wounds and hurts in the church. And then you look at Matthew chapter 19, right at the beginning, he's dealing with how spouses are to treat one another, and specifically deals with the issue of divorce. And one thing I know is that church and marriage are two of the places where the biggest hurts can develop. They are big places where pain can build up. But instead of letting that pain build up, what Jesus invites us to do in chapter 18, prior to this parable, is he gives us a formula for how to deal with when someone has sinned against you, when someone has wronged you. It's actually probably the thing that provokes Jesus to tell this parable in the first place, because Peter asks, how much do I need to forgive people? How often, how many times do I need to forgive people? And this happens in the context of Jesus saying, when someone sins against you or wrongs you, first thing you do is you go talk to them. You don't go talk behind their back first, but you talk to them. You clear the air, because we as Jesus followers have had the spreadsheet thrown out. So we are not going to live by the spreadsheet with our brothers and sisters. Instead, we are going to go to them and have meaningful conversations so that we can fix things and reconcile. And after that initial conversation, Jesus gives ways of escalating the confrontation so that reconciliation can actually happen. If you want a video on that, I can make one, just leave it in the comments. But he ends that chapter and sets up the marriage discussion by saying, hey, let's stop living according to the spreadsheet. Look at this fool who was forgiven so much and then was unwilling to forgive the people around him. I'm glad Jesus told such a provocative story, because I definitely needed it. What a good God was willing to forgive us the billions.